Okay, we're live. Hi everyone, thank you for joining us for another STEM Women Hangout on Air. Today our guest is Kate Brodock, who's the president of Girls in Tech, and Kate is going to talk to us about what Girls in Tech is, how she got into it, what's it like in startup culture, and things like that. So, Kate, let's jump right in. You're the president of Girls in Tech. Can you tell us a bit about yourself and your role within the organization?
Yes, I am currently president. I have a long-standing, I've actually been involved with Girls in Tech for about going on 7 years now, actually. I was first introduced to it at a conference that I was visiting. They had a booth at the conference, and I was at the time living in Boston. So I actually touched base. They didn't have a Boston chapter at the time. And so I actually offered to start that chapter. So I started in the organization by being we call the managing directors of a chapter. And the organization itself has started pretty grassroots. So when we first started, it was really just a bunch of chapters would pop up with interested women. Since then, we've created much more of an organizational structure. And just through me, I think, wanting to get a little bit more involved, I had a pretty good speaking relationship with the founder, Adriana Gascoigne, who's now I now work very closely with, and I just sort of moved myself into this role by continuing to get involved and that sort of thing. My background is a mix between startup entrepreneurship, marketing, and tech type of things. I graduated from undergrad. I was actually a political science history major, and then I jumped right into the startup scene in Boston into a technology transfer company. We actually called it a startup for startups because we worked closely with tech startups right out of, it was right outside of MIT, so we would actually work, it started by doing a lot of projects with MIT. They couldn't get a lot of support from the tech transfer office there, so they would come work with us. Then we started branching out. So I was right in the mix of the really neat Cambridge, Boston startup scene. Then went back to school for international relations and business. Worked a little bit in the corporate world at Bose, which was very cool, but then decided really I liked the startup world, got back into, I started a marketing strategy firm in 2008, and that's when I also became involved in Girls in Tech. So since then, it's been that and a mix. I'm a social media marketer. I've been doing some social media marketing and that sort of thing. So that's very briefly my background.
So how do you use your international relations? How do you blend that into the work that you've been doing in startup?
Yeah, so, well, first of all, the impetus behind getting both degrees, I had always wanted to get a degree either in history or, history or political science or international relations. So my primary focus had been actually the international relations degree, but I went to the Fletcher School at Tufts, and at the time, a lot of the graduates were going much more into into sectors such as, UN or a lot of government sectors, that type of thing. I wanted to add a little bit more of for me, and not that those aren't practical, but for me, I wanted to add a little bit more of the business sense. So that's why I actually then combined it with the MBA program. And I've actually really enjoyed the combination of both of those. So, and especially with Girls in Tech, I have found it immensely valuable to have both of those degrees. I went to a professional school for international relations, so as opposed to purely academic. This was actually skills-based professional. So having an understanding of how to take either business, whether it's a startup or a large business, and think about how that fits into society, politics, culture, etc., and then across many societies, cultures, etc. That's been actually very, very valuable for me in growing. And I love the combination of both of those. I also worked a little bit in the with social media. I worked a lot on digital activism. So I was, quote, getting paid for being a social media marketer, and I was able to do some research using a lot of those tools, and then how they would play out in digital activism, social activism, with the wave of, the most prominent example would be Arab Spring, what happened there with Twitter and everybody coming together and mobilizing. So those are just a couple of examples. I've actually found it incredibly valuable to have both of those degrees. So
I think it's really great, and particularly I can just see how important it is to have that understanding of not-for-profits that comes from international relations and blending it with tech. Yeah.
Yeah.
So can you tell us a little bit, for our audience who may not be familiar with what Girls in Tech actually does? What types of what are you set up to do, and what types of programs do you run?
Yep. So we are focused on women in technology and entrepreneurship. It's a global nonprofit, and we do in our programming consider the full life cycle of a woman. So part of the reason it's actually called Girls in Tech is that we also have mentorship programs for K through 12, or the international equivalent, also for university. But our main chapter focus is professional women in technology and startups. We do try to be as inclusive as possible when we say technology, but we tend to focus on the technology that you might see out of, for lack of a better description, out of Silicon Valley. So we have a lot of coding, high tech, mobile, that type of thing. But depending also where you are geographically, some of our chapters will tend to focus, for instance, our Phoenix chapter in Arizona in general, there's a large green tech community. So they, as a chapter, will have a little bit more of a focus on green tech. And then for entrepreneurship, really, again, we try to be as inclusive as possible. We have many, many people in large organizations. We're really talking about the entrepreneurial skill set when we're doing that. We do have programming very specifically for women trying to start a company. So we'll have entrepreneurship boot camps, pitch competitions, that sort of thing, resources for women. But we also include, of course, in many of our events, women from large companies, and that sort of thing. We do try to make programming be as inclusive as possible. So that's really a little bit of the breakdown. We have 42 chapters around the world. I have a list of a good 15 or 20 chapters who have contacted me that they want to start. So we're talking to them now. Hopefully we'll start most of them in the next 3-4 months. So it's really exciting. And each of our chapters can kind of take an essence of what we're doing globally and then also localize it. So it's really, we've really, really enjoyed it. But yeah, that's the gist of the company, or the organization. So
that's wonderful. It's it just sounds so vibrant and really practical based.
Yeah. So we love it. So
so you've got a decade of experience in the tech world, particularly in startups. So what have been some of your experiences as a woman in the startup world?
Well, I need to say, and I get asked this a lot, I've got to say I have been lucky. My first job at that tech transfer company I was speaking about, I didn't even realize it at the time, but after being there for 2.5 years, I very much realized I had my two bosses, the owners of the company, were two women, and they focused a lot on women in leadership positions. They focused a lot on women-owned companies. So, that was a great start of my professional year. I've also been in situations, I've got a very supportive family. Whether it was out of ignorance or not, I've never necessarily felt that I have been growing up. I never felt that I was in any sort of position where I was being discriminated against or anything like that. Actually, my mom wanted me to become a doctor, and she wanted me to do biochemical engineering and all of that stuff. So I have myself been very lucky. But what I always tell people is that is not the case, both nationally and internationally. And that's really why I do a lot of my work, is that I want other women to have the same experiences that I do and have the same support network and be able to do what I have been able to do. In any situation that I've been in, it's never been as much. Basically, it's been me standing up and saying, you know what, that might have been discouraging, but I'm going to work my hardest to not have that be a discouraging situation. We have people in our network where it is not remotely as easy as that. They have societal pressures, they have actual policy that prohibits them, hurdles to get over, family structure, even just a lack of a social space to come together and realize that you have a community of women in tech. So I think that's a lot why I do what I do, is that I know that people out there, women out there, are not in as lucky of a situation that I have had myself. And I always get a little defensive of some of the people who address, some of the women particularly, I guess, who address this situation, saying, you know, I've been, not me personally, they're speaking on their behalf, but they have been lucky. They don't see any problem in the system. They've always had doors open for them and that sort of thing. I say, yes, that's fantastic for you, but it just is not the same in every place that we're talking about. So that's really why I do what I do.
Yeah, that's a problem we notice in academia as well. There's many people who say, well, I've never experienced it, therefore it's not a problem, and they don't recognize that it's actually a systemic problem. And just because you might have been lucky to not have to have, ever personally deal with it, doesn't mean everyone is. And it's up to everyone to speak up as you do, and I think it's very important.
And speaking of academia, it's funny, I actually got in a conversation about this with some colleagues of mine. I adjunct professor at one of the local universities here, and I got in a conversation, and sometimes the situation is that people simply, they don't realize that it's happening. There's such small cases and such small nuances that are happening that they don't realize it. So they're in a system that might actually be biased against women, or at the very minimum not supportive of women, and they literally just don't even realize that it's happening because there's such small cases. So that's also part of what we try to highlight and discuss and change. We don't want to just talk about it. We actually want to create change. So
that kind of leads me to our next question for you, because there's been studies that show that investors are less likely to back women-led startups, and it's harder to break into this, boys-only networking events and things like that. What advice can you give to other young women who are interested in leading their own tech startup company?
So this is a loaded question. My first answer would be there tend to be a lot of different reasons why women-led startups or women don't get invested in a lot. It's everything from I have actually had conversations with many women who they're uncomfortable actually with the pitch process. So they get into a situation where they are pitching to investors, and they are very uncomfortable with that. So in that particular instance, practicing your pitch and getting out and owning that process. And then there's everything from the family situation. That's something that I tell women, do not change that to, or don't have that suffer so that you can then go get funding. There are also investors in general, not just women investors, who are more open to accepting women. So there are actually a host of different problems, I guess you could say, with investing in women. I also think that a lot of times when this question is asked, you see it 90% of the time, the question is always to the women about what women can be doing in that situation. I'd like to hear a lot more the question being asked of men, because there are many men who are supportive of women in technology, of women in entrepreneurship. And I'd like to have the question be asked a lot more about what men can be doing in this situation to be helping women who are not only just going out investing, but in the entire industry itself as well. We just had, and I'm so pleased about this, I had a young man in Nigeria who contacted me a couple of months ago, and he asked and he said, do you have any men who run chapters of your organization? And I actually said, you know, we haven't yet, but why don't I talk to you about that? And we had a couple of Skype conversations, and he was so enthusiastic. He said, I'm so dedicated to this cause. I know wonderful women in the industry. We need a chapter of this in Nigeria, and I want to start it. And he was our first managing director of Girls in Tech. Of all of our 42 chapters, he was our first male. Yeah. I was so, but that's an example, too, of not only what can women do to get over the hurdles that are in the industry, but how can we start also leveraging men who are not only men who are already supportive of the issue, but also how can we educate men that these things are happening. Again, a lot of it comes down to denial. They don't see that this is an issue. They don't think about it when they're being pitched and that sort of thing. So how can we educate and bring in men into that process as well? Because if you think about it, they're half of the equation. So we need to use half of that.
Yeah, one of the hangouts we do, one of the series we do is how men can help as well address this issue, because you know we are STEM women, but it's not just a women's issue. Recognizing and dealing with this problem falls down to all of us. It's not just a women's issue.
Absolutely.
So yes, you make a great point with that. So I guess if I were to flip that question around, how would you say that more men can help it? I mean, you just said, give that great example about your Nigerian colleague. Do you have other examples like that?
I think men can make themselves perhaps a little bit more available for things like mentorship roles. There are many actually specifically in investment. There are actually many investment firms right now who are trying to, they're kind of in figuring out stages, figuring out how they can create more of a pipeline. But even just as running that investment firm, being very knowledgeable of the fact that they want to increase the number of women-led companies. That's an excellent step, and making that an initiative. And then also anything from being on the board of advisors for any of these things. Brad Feld is actually an excellent example of this. He's someone who's been very supportive of women-led startups. He acts on the boards of many nonprofit organizations that are focused on either women in technology, women in entrepreneurship. And I'm sure you guys know Vivek Wadhya at Stanford. He's an excellent example. He's actually done a load of research on the topic and has a series of prescriptions that he would offer to people to start implementing. But I think men, this is, it's also, we have to realize that men sometimes are in the reverse situation that we are, is that they also will see an organization like Girls in Tech, for instance, and it might be anything from intimidating to simply, well, that's not my place, and that type of thing. And so recognizing that they can have a role within this space, I think, is very important. All of our chapter events have always been open to men. We have always looped men into anything from fundraising to getting advice to speakers to anything. So I think getting involved in events that are specifically focused on women in entrepreneurship or women in tech or women in STEM, I think would be very important. And then if we think about our next generation, also thinking about any sort of mentorship events, mentorship initiatives that they can get involved in. I'm sure that you have seen many of the leaders now, women leaders who are in CEO positions, for instance. You'll often hear them say, I have an excellent mentor who's a male. And that's okay. You don't always have to have a male or a female who is your mentor. But if men can make themselves available to women in a mentorship role or anything like that, I think that's very important as well. And then also, lastly, just obvious. It's so obvious I didn't even think about it. But hiring decisions as well. So if they do own a company or they're in a decision-making position within a tech company or a STEM company or a startup, making an effort to make sure that they're filling the ranks. And I do, one note on that, I do always have people think about it's not just filling the quota. It's not just saying I want to increase the number of women to increase the number of women. There are real benefits to having women on your team. Yeah. They offer excellent perspectives. And I could go over the research. I won't right now, but it's more than just saying we want to have 40% women because. Yeah. There really is a diversity issue there that should be taken into account as well.
So, what are actually some of the success stories that you can share with us about Girls in Tech? I mean, you've got a few examples already about people contacting you out of their own initiative, but what else can you tell us about the inspiring and rewarding experiences you've seen?
Yeah, this is my favorite part. It's where it's what makes me get up in the morning about this. But we have a lot of examples of women around the world who are just so thankful for having Girls in Tech as a network. And one example is we got recent feedback from our Egypt chapter in Cairo. A member there, she was so and as you may know, that area in general, that region in general, has not been very stable for the past several years. So there's been a lot of flux, and we had a member who was so happy that we were able to provide, again, this platform that they didn't have before. They didn't even know that there was a community that existed of women in the tech space that they could access. So because Girls in Tech was able to bring that platform together and bring those women together, it really caused a surge of energy in that space in Cairo in a time that I think everybody in general really needed a surge of energy. Another great example is our Chilean chapter. Latin and South America, culturally speaking, they're not very research driven. So what was happening in Chile is that a lot of their policies, their governmental policies, were being set using research from the U.S. So it was all U.S. research on women in the workforce in the U.S. setting Chilean policy. So you can imagine how that doesn't work very well. So our Chilean chapter recognized that immediately, and one of their big initiatives is that they are going to start providing some of that research so that their policies can better fit those women on the ground and really try to make an impact on the ground for the women there. And then, we have a bunch of other, the mentorship program, all the events that we have with young girls are just those are really exciting to me because, we always get these events and they're fun events. We get hands-on and we have workshops and everything, but I always love them because you leave with these girls so happy and so excited about the industry that they go out and they want to play more with stuff and that sort of thing. So anytime that happens, I get very, very, very happy. So those are just a couple of the feel-good stories that we have. But I think it's been pretty well received just to be able to have, again, a network, and then also a network that's connected to each other. I always love seeing the managing directors of various chapters in our organization. You know, our Paris chapter MD will visit San Francisco, and they'll get together for coffee, you know, or a drink or something like that. That's also what I love too, is just the leaders of all our chapters understand that they're in a global network, and they can access each other, and that they're really part of a larger thing, if you will. So I really enjoy that.
Yeah, definitely. One thing we wanted to ask you is, you know, you're quite visible on social media. You're on Twitter, Google+, Facebook, and it can sometimes be quite a toxic environment for women, you know, with the recent trolls that, for example, that Anita, with the video game stuff she got, for example. What are some of the challenges you face in this context? Because sometimes people, you know, you can get people's backs up. How do you think we can create a safer environment for women in STEM on social media?
Yeah, this is also a loaded question, because again, we have this environment that the social media, at the end of the day, they're tools, they're platforms, and generally speaking, people's own way of thinking comes out on these platforms, right? So the biggest thing is we still have an education system, as an educational issue, where we have to educate people more on women in STEM, women in technology, why it's not appropriate to be saying some things that I think for some reason some people think they can still say on social media, and understanding that just the public nature of social media actually requires, I think one of the problems is that it's almost too easy to talk on social media. I like to tell people, you know, this really actually requires even more of a thought process than maybe if you're out at a networking event talking to people. It's so public. It's so real time. It's so, and things can spiral so quickly.
And it's also permanent. There's a record of it afterwards.
Yep. Yeah. It's permanent. There's a record of it afterwards. An excellent point. And so that, you really need to think even more about what you're saying, how you're interacting to people, how that's going to come across on your own sort of personal brand online. And we've seen a lot of instances where, you know, for this particular topic, men have gotten in situations where they've maybe said something on social media, or something they may not have said on social media gets onto social media. And there's a little bit of a oops,
yeah,
type of moment. And I really do think that it's not even, that question is still inside the whole question of how we better the environment for women in STEM. I do say to women, because social media, because it's so open, because it's so easy to talk, because it's so easy to get into informal, for women, I say, when you get on social media, make sure you know what your boundaries are. Make sure you know how much you're going to share, anything from how controversial you're going to be, what topics you're going to talk about, that type of thing. How much of your private life do you want to be sharing? And I say this to everybody, but especially for women, I think if women can sit down and say that to themselves beforehand and set the tone that they are going to have on social media, and I think for me, committing to being professional, committing to being you know, above bar, which is, you know, no low blows, no public outbursts, nothing
You
like
get
that.
angry on Twitter, walk
Nothing,
away.
no getting angry, and saving face. If somebody else is getting angry at you, stay
Yeah,
professional about it,
yeah.
and don't instigate and that sort of thing. This is a little bit of my philosophy as well. But I do encourage people to sit down and think about what those boundaries are for themselves, so that they can go in and feel more comfortable online because they've set those boundaries. And I think a lot of people don't set those boundaries until they're in the thick of it, and then they're in a situation where they've gotten into an uncomfortable position. So I always say, if you can set those blinders and move forward, generally speaking, I think you're going to be in a much more confident position, and one where you can deal with colleagues or non-colleagues in a way that you are going to walk away from that situation feeling good about yourself. So yeah.
I think I really like the idea of, teaching these skills. I think we all assume that you can just jump on social media and that you'll wing it or you'll work it out. And I love what you're saying, because I think that women in particular could use coaching in this area.
Yeah, absolutely. You really do need to think about it.
It's because social media, it started out as a way to share your, wedding pictures with your grandmother, and it's personal and it stays in that little bubble. But unfortunately now it's not that, and yet many people think it's okay to, be very unprofessional around your profile, but it's not, because the whole world can see you, and that's not always okay. You need to have that distinction between your private life and the way you behave and your professionalism, rather.
Yeah. Yep. And that's exactly it. Is just understanding where you're going to stop on that sort of continuum. So, yeah.
So we're almost up at we are up at the half an hour mark. Do you have any last words you wanted to add before we say goodbye?
No, I don't have too much to add. For all of the viewers out there, I think, for all the women out there, I encourage you to assess your situation. If you're ever finding that you're up against a discouraging situation or hurdles or anything like that, go out and find. There are many networks, not just Girls in Tech. There are many networks available for people to go out. Other women, men who are supportive, etc. For the men out there, I would say for yourselves, if you're interested in this topic and this issue, go out and figure out how you can contribute to, whether it's locally, nationally, internationally. I definitely encourage people to do that. And then, and then for everybody, think about our wonderful next generation of women in technology in the STEM fields. And I think that's it.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, everyone, for watching us as well.
Thanks.
Our next hangout is in 2 weeks' time, where we'll be talking to Amy Brand from Digital Science. And please follow our page, our Twitter feed, and you'll get updated about that event. Bye for now.